Hello. Poor Strafford. He died on the scaffold in May 1641, believing his death would end his regal master's problems. But as we shall see, those problems had only just begun. Almost immediately, Puritans in Parliament attempted to abolish bishops. They failed to secure the necessary votes. Charles responded by trying to curry favour with parliamentary moderates. But in October there arose another crisis when rebellion broke out in Ireland. Yet again, Charles needed money from Parliament to raise an army in order to suppress rebellious subjects, this time Irish Catholics, angered by their loss of power and land to immigrants from England and Scotland. Fearing Charles would use that army against Parliament, the House of Commons refused him the necessary money and passed instead the so-called Grand Remonstrance, transferring sovereignty from the monarchy to Parliament, and the Militia Act that removed Charles as Commander-in-Chief. Charles simply refused to sign these pieces of legislation that would have made him subservient to Parliament. Hearing rumours that Parliament intended to impeach his beloved wife, Henrietta Marie, for allegedly conspiring with Irish Catholic rebels, he decided to act. What he did next triggered a series of events that resulted in civil war between Crown and Parliament. Learning that 5 members of Parliament had conspired with Scottish rebels, he went with a detachment of armed men to arrest them during a debate in the House of Commons. Forewarned, the 5 men escaped just before Charles arrived. Charles then did something no English monarch had done before. He entered the chamber of the House of Commons and sat imperiously in the Speaker's chair, considered an outrageous breach of parliamentary privilege. As he left, his birds having flown, as he put it, shouts of privilege, privilege, resounded through the chamber. Metaphorically speaking, the first shot of the ensuing civil war had been fired. Soon, real shots would be heard throughout the land. Because a majority of Londoners supported Parliament, Charles's position in his capital became untenable. Fleeing London and sending his wife and children abroad for their safety, Charles established a new capital at Oxford. Shortly thereafter, the nation was at war with itself. Supporters of Charles were dubbed royalists or cavaliers. Parliament supporters were called parliamentarians or roundheads due to their closely cropped hair. Puritans, townsmen, and those who engaged in business or commerce, especially if they lived in southeast England, tended to support Parliament. Anglicans and those who lived in rural districts, especially if they lived in northern and western England, tended to remain loyal to Charles. But these, ladies and gentlemen, are very broad generalizations indeed. And we should remember that civil wars invariably pit father against son, brother against brother, the English Civil War being no exception. Now, the war that saw its first blood spilt in the summer of 1642 ended with the capture of Oxford 4 years later. Charles became a prisoner of Parliament. After escaping and briefly resuming the war with help from the Scots, Charles was recaptured, tried for treason, found guilty of waging war against the English people, and sentenced to death. While the court was in session, Charles simply refused to plead, claiming no court in England had the right to try him. Throughout, he conducted himself with the utmost dignity. Courageous to the end, Charles went to his execution on the 30th of January 1649, playing the role of the martyred king to perfection as he crossed the parkland of central London to the scaffold that had been erected in front of the banqueting hall in Whitehall. Fearing the cold of an English winter would cause him to shiver and appear afraid, he wore 2 shirts to keep him warm. Ever defiant, he told those assembled on the scaffold that a sovereign and a subject were clean different things. He had tried to live the life of a divinely sanctioned absolutist monarch and was now going to die like one. He added that he was going from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown where no disturbance can be, no disturbance in the world. After kneeling in prayer, he placed his head on the block and then raised his arms like wings to indicate to his executioner that it was time to swing the blade. Evidence suggests that his head was cleanly removed from his body with a single well-placed blow. As he was beheaded, the crowd let out a great moan and people rushed forward to dip their handkerchiefs in his blood. Now, I know Charles had his faults, and one isn't supposed to defend royal absolutism in this democratic and enlightened age, but I can't help admiring this very courageous and at times gracious king. His great taste and appreciation for beauty led him to found the Royal Art Collection, which one can see today if one visits London. He was also a faithful husband at a time when most kings boasted mistresses, and was a loving father to his 7 children besides. Reading the account of his farewell to 2 of those children, Elizabeth and Henry, on the eve of his execution, in which he implores them to fear God and forgive their enemies, it is difficult not to weep. And then there was his magnificent performance at his execution, which left no one who saw it or read about it later unmoved. As Malcolm says of Corder in Macbeth, nothing in his life became him like the leaving of it. He died as one that had been studied in his death to throw away the dearest thing he owed, as 'twere a careless trifle. Now, one who made that death more likely was a man whose contributions to English history are impossible to overstate. Political radical and committed Calvinist, it had been Oliver Cromwell who convinced moderate parliamentarians that the only way to atone for the bloodletting of the recent Civil War would be to shed the blood of the man who allegedly caused it. Now, this Puritan member of the gentry and landowner from East Anglia had some right to have his views taken seriously. For during the war, he had hastened the Royalists' defeat by creating the new model army that had brought extraordinary battlefield discipline and religious fervour to the parliamentary forces, making possible the victory that brought the impenitent Charles to trial. In the radically different England that followed Charles I's execution in 1649, Cromwell emerged as the indispensable man. Supported by the army, he eventually bore the title Lord Protector, king in all but name, and tried to turn England into what was called a godly commonwealth. With the death of Charles, England became a republic for the first and only time in its history. It was a revolutionary moment in which some called for the equality of all men and asked awkward questions about economic inequality and the continued existence of rich and poor. Increasingly, however, Cromwell, in order to maintain power, was obliged to rely on the army, dividing England into military districts ruled by major generals dubbed godly governors. Indulgent towards Protestants of all kinds and even Jews, he was nevertheless rabidly anti-Catholic and held a particular detestation for the Catholic Mass. Quickly tiring of theocratic rule and insufferable Puritan strictures, the English people supported the restoration of the monarchy after Cromwell's death in 1658. Now, after a brief interlude that saw Cromwell's genial but ineffectual son Richard as Lord Protector, Charles I's son, also called Charles, was invited back from foreign exile to become King Charles II. Now, this period in English history is known as the Restoration and was known for its licentious character, about which we learn much in Samuel Pepys' extraordinarily candid diary. The tone was set by Charles himself, who became famous for his many mistresses and extravagant lifestyle. However, when it came to dealing with Parliament, he was much more cautious, seeking compromise and accommodation. By cooperating with Parliament and not acting the divine right absolutist monarch, Charles received the funds he needed to maintain his court and string of expensive mistresses. But later in his reign, secretly receiving large amounts of money from Louis XIV of France, he was able to pay less attention to Parliament and indulge his absolutist tendencies. Now, Louis was paying Charles to bring England back to the Catholic camp, and evidence strongly suggests that Charles himself was a Roman Catholic in all but name. A crisis arose towards the end of his reign, however, when it looked likely that Charles, who had no legitimate children, would be succeeded by his overtly and unashamedly Catholic brother, James, Duke of York. Whatever his private feelings, Charles showed outward respect to the Church of England. Many feared that James, once king, would not, and would instead seek to reconcile England to Rome. Thus, the so-called exclusion crisis, around which two parties formed. The Whigs, who wanted to exclude James from the line of succession, and the Tories, who believed James should succeed his brother Charles regardless of his Catholicism. Now, the Tories won out, at least temporarily, and James succeeded to the throne on his brother's death. The Whigs were not too concerned by this. James had had two daughters, Mary and Anne, by his first wife, Anne Hyde, both of whom were Protestant. But he had had no sons to displace his daughters in the line of succession, and no children by his second wife, the Catholic Mary of Modena. If James were to die, therefore, he would be succeeded by the Protestant Mary, his daughter with Anne Hyde. So, although James was openly Catholic, he would be succeeded by a Protestant queen, or so people thought. However, 3 years after becoming king, James's second wife, Mary, gave birth to a healthy baby boy. For many, this was the last straw. That boy, as everyone knew only too well, outranked his grown sisters in the line of succession. He would also be raised Catholic and return England to union with Rome. James had already angered many Anglican Protestants the previous year with the Declaration of Indulgence that extended toleration to nonconformists and Catholics, an enlightened piece of legislation by the standards of the day. But Anglican Whig elites in Parliament were having none of it. Taking the initiative but acting illegally, they offered James II's Protestant daughter, Mary, her father's throne. She accepted, but on one condition, that her husband, the Dutchman William of Orange, became king and rule with her. Parliament, eager to ensure the Protestant succession, agreed to her condition, and William and Mary became the first and only time in English history that a king and queen have ruled jointly. William, as we saw earlier, was pleased to accept the crown of England, as it greatly added to those forces opposed to Louis XIV. Invited by the English Parliament to invade England, William of Orange landed an army at Torbay in Devon and began to march on London. Meanwhile, James II, although a physically brave man, was forced to vacate the throne and flee to France, having been deserted by most of his Protestant officers and other officials. Thus, William and Mary became joint sovereigns in what became known as the Glorious Revolution, so called because virtually no blood was spilt. While James II tried to regain his crown, he suffered a disastrous defeat in Ireland at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, at which a Catholic Irish army, with help from the French, were routed by a Protestant army led by William of Orange. Later, James's son and grandson, known as the Old and Young Pretenders respectively, also tried repeatedly to regain the English crown in what are known as the Jacobite rebellions, but all their efforts also came to naught. Now, to conclude, the Glorious Revolution provides the capstone to the constitutional history of England and what became the United Kingdom. Now, why this is so will form the focus of the next lecture. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.